miss, if I feel free to just say, hey, hit the
Okay,
next one.
no worries, will do.
I'm gonna mute myself for now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you all here. I know that folks are being let in at the moment, so we'll go ahead and give you a minute to join. Please feel free to grab snacks, drinks, anything you need to support yourself for the next 30 to 45 minutes. It's great to be here with you all. And happy December. Okay. Arrivals are slowing down, so I will go ahead and get us started. My name is Siana Garrido Walker Flaw. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a partner at the Avarna Group. We've been here with you all before. It's great to be back. Callum, I will go ahead and pass it to you to introduce yourself, and then we'll keep going.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kellum Tate Jones. I use she or they pronouns, and I am a partner of the Avarna Group, and I also work for my own consulting company, Refugium. I'll pass it back to Siana.
Thanks, Callum. Excited to have you here with us today. So, all of you have joined us to talk about bridging across divides. And I want to just give a brief snapshot of what we'll be moving through in the next 45 minutes or so. The first thing is just to talk about what bridging is. It's no secret that we're all in a time of profound divisiveness. And whether those divides are showing up in your communities, in your social circles, or in this industry, that divisiveness is palpable. And so we want to spend some time talking about what bridging is in the workplace, in the communities you partner with, and within your industry. We also want to talk about why bridging is important to the industry of biking, to really think about what it looks like to bridge in within our communities and to understand why it's so necessary, especially in this moment. And then we'll talk about approaches to bridging. So we'll finalize our discussion with talking about what it looks like to create sustainable bridges to support you all to put these ideas into practice. We do want to make sure to create space for you to engage with us, even though this is a webinar. So we'll be dropping some questions in the chat for you to respond to, either in chat or just to reflect on. And at the end, we'll want to collect some ideas from you all to share so that you can do some resource sharing with each other. And there's also going to be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So to get us started with that first question, I will drop in the chat an opportunity for you to reflect. You don't need to respond in the chat, but this is just an opportunity for you to reflect. And the question is for you to think of a time when you have felt othered in the workplace or in the realm of biking. We'll give you all a minute to reflect on that question, and then Callum will get us started.
Okay, so we're going to start off with thinking about some basic questions about what is bridging. So, civil rights scholar Dr. John A. Powell has a quote, bridging fosters acceptance both of those we might have othered and even aspects of ourselves. And one thing I think is really interesting about Dr. Powell is that he spells his name in all lowercase because he wants to bring attention to the fact that as a human, we are simply members of the natural world and not separate from it, which I think is a beautiful way of bridging, even just in the typographical structure of his name. So, in John's framework of bridging, we're sort of starting with acknowledging that humans other each other all the time. So by other, I mean we build distinctions between each other and ourselves. So we all have different lived experiences, different cultural backgrounds. We may speak different languages, have different accents. We have different likes and dislikes and needs. But unfortunately, we tend to use these differences to other one another. So These differences that are sort of inherent into our identities are we often sort of employ them as ways to set ourselves apart. And we use these differences to justify the way that we disregard each other, the way that we devalue and dehumanize each other. And the emergent impact of all of these othering behaviors really is what creates the systems of oppression that we find ourselves living in. So, systems of oppression like racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, heterosexism, cisgenderism. And these systems of oppression or systems of othering are then built into institutions, policy, law, organizational policies, procedures, et cetera. So even if we're all nice to each other, even if we're kind to each other to our face, to each other's faces, othering can still occur because of the structures that we exist within. But bridging is what allows us to cultivate belonging. So when we create bridges between the different experiences and identities and backgrounds that we have, that's what allows us to really begin to connect with each other and break down these artificial separations. So before kind of thinking about like how we actually go about creating these bridges, just a couple of examples of how this othering, the disconnections kind of show up in policy. So for instance, in the 1950s, 1960s, there were incredibly inequitable housing practices. And one of those housing practices was housing covenants. So these would be documents that when people would buy homes would specifically prohibit them from selling those homes to Black buyers, to other potential buyers of color. Even though this was ruled illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968, that language nonetheless remained on covenants for decades afterwards, even if it was struck. So, for instance, my PhD advisor actually bought a house where there was still a clause in the deed of the home that they bought that still had the prohibition against selling to potential Black buyers. And you can still see the impacts of these kinds of housing practices in current urban demographic geography. And another example of this is in the structure of the SAT college admission test. So that was developed by Princeton psychology professor and also infamous eugenicist Carl Brigham. And after he published the widely read eugenicist text, A Study of American Intelligence, he actually was hired by the College Board to create a college admission test. And that is what became the SAT. And interestingly enough, he himself collected the results of the test and sort of studied them for the next few years. And by 1930, he himself had said, yep, this test actually only measures the test takers' fluency with English, whether they attended good schools or not, and how familiar they are with white culture. But despite that, the SAT is still widely used for college admission and scholarship awards. Um, I learned all of this from Ijeoma Oluo's excellent book, Mediocre. So, how do we actually approach bridging with people across different ideas, values, and approaches? So, one of the real first steps here is leading with curiosity rather than argument. So it's really, really easy for us to just want to like prove our point, like, hey, like it's not okay to do X, Y, or Z, and here's why. And let me give you all of my really well researched reasons as to why that is not something that we want to do. But when we lead with argument, we are not, that's not, we're not coming from a place of being interested in connecting with people. So leading with curiosity rather than argument can be a really effective way of of building bridges with people by asking questions, wanting to get to know them better before we move straight into trying to argue. Next, we want to really like listen deeply for that bridge and rather than listening for the difference. So, where's the point of connection here? So, for instance, my parents, my dad is a gravel biker. He does a couple of gravel bike races every year, and he is really into gravel biking. And but we have very different political stances and beliefs about the world. But I have found like so one of the things that we're able to connect over is our interest in the different birds that we see when I'm out hiking or when he's out biking. And so that's a place that we are able to connect. And that is often a sort of bridge for me to be able to talk to my dad about different things that otherwise there would not necessarily be a connection for. And odd, it's sometimes I think it's kind of funny the way that like we end up talking about more important things when we're, bridging across from talking about ducks and game birds. But again, that's about listening deeply for that bridge, rather than for the difference. And so right along with this is that focus on relationship building. So instead of aiming at this sort of end goal of getting everyone on the same page and having everyone agree with each other, instead focusing on how can I connect with you as a human being? How can I build a relationship with you as a fellow traveler on this planet on the road of life? And focusing on connecting with people on a human level and understanding who they are, because so often we just see we see the immediate, we see the person who's right in front of us. We all tend to make snap judgments. But when there's a quote that a college professor shared with me that I always think about, that when a comet is heading towards you, you just see this like bright light and it's just really concentrated right there. But if you turn to the side, then you're able to see this like hundreds of kilometers long like tail of the comet, that trails out behind it, and that's the whole history of a person that you don't see when you just meet them in the moment. And so remembering that every single person you meet has this long comet tail behind them, and then investing in them in terms of a relationship can be really useful for, not just for bridging, but also just for making your life richer, and building out the experiences that you have. And finally, remembering that everyone wants to find a space where they belong. So we as human beings have evolved as social creatures. We need each other. We need connection. That's why loneliness is possibly the most painful human emotion, because we literally evolved to need to be in social groups with each other to survive. A single human being out in the wild outside of civilization is going to have a really hard, if not impossible, time surviving. So, as a result, we have a deep evolutionary need inside of us to belong to a group of people. And when we remember, when we're, in these, it can be in very tense conversations. I remember once hiking with my dad, we came across there was a guy who came up on a mountain bike, and we stopped and talked to him, and he just, for some reason, immediately launched into a political conversation, and was in a very had a very different perspective than my dad, and just watching the um, initial excitement of my dad to like, oh, here's like a guy in Oregon that I can connect with who's biking, and then sort of the look of just shock as this guy goes on this big tirade of things that I actually agreed with. But I noticed that this like initial interest in connecting and finding this sort of moment of belonging was sort of dashed by this intense political discussion. So remembering that when we enter into these conversations, finding that bridge, finding that connection can help create a space of belonging. And when we create these containers of safety, people are better able to learn and become more open to new ideas. All right. Sienna.
Thank you, Callum, so much for sort of setting the foundation for us and understanding what bridging is, and leading us to this point of understanding why bridging is so important. And I know that we've talked in previous webinars about the importance of continuing to do equity work. And it's no secret, it is probably the elephant in the room when it's not being talked about, that over the last year, this work continues to be a point of contention for some and definitely a point of misunderstanding for others, and finding ways to bring folks along on this journey who otherwise don't see themselves connected to this work is kind of where we're focusing today. And again, we're not talking about bridging with folks who cannot see the humanity in others, right? We're talking about those who we see from day to day, folks that we're working with, that we build with, that we bike with, who have walked different paths than us and are just not sure that there's a place for them in an industry that's equitable. So I want to talk about this in three ways. First, I want to talk about people. And when I talk about people, I'm talking about folks who work within your organizations or within your companies. And especially in times of heightened divisiveness, employees need to know that they're able to show up fully as themselves, to feel supported, and to be able to do their best work, right? So all of us have different versions of ourselves who we are on our bikes out in the community. It looks a little bit different than who we are at work. But when we are able to bring sort of that full work self with us to show up and feel welcomed and supported, it's an incredibly critical portion of what allows us to do our best work. And if there's lack of clear strategic direction, including the values that the organization or your company holds, employees can feel disconnected from the foundation that should really ground your work. And that can lead to decreased sense of inclusion and ultimately attrition. Creating opportunities for employees to realign themselves with company values, understand how their work directly impacts the overall goals of the business, and then know how they can create spaces of belonging for each other benefits not only your teams, but also your products. The next way that I want to talk about, and aspects of building bridges and where to think about building bridges is within your programs. And when I talk about programs, I'm referring to the work that you do in the communities that you serve and partner with. This one is really about how you frame your company's mission, values, and vision in ways that resonate and engage your various biking communities. So, just as your internal teams don't necessarily hold the same ideas or have the same lived experiences, your communities are coming together on one shared interest through a variety of different paths. Some are connected through recreation, others through professional pathways, some through an interest in improving city infrastructure and positively impacting our local environment through alternative forms of transportation. Some of your communities are wealthy, they're able bodied, and find your products in the industry of biking accessible and inclusive. And others are connected to biking through local community organizations that pool community resources and operate off of grants to purchase bikes for community members who otherwise cannot afford them. I know one of the major ways that I used to be connected to biking was in Richmond, California, where we had a few different biking organizations that really empowered young people to have their first experiences out biking just in the city with each other. We'd have bike parties, which is one of my favorite ways to engage in biking. And some of your communities have all the gear and the clips and the lycra, right? They have all the right things. And others have what they have that makes them feel comfortable in these biking communities. And playing music loudly and just being in community with each other is another way that folks really like to engage in biking communities. As I mentioned, one of my favorite ways to do so. So thinking about all of the different communities that engage with your work, that want to participate in your industry, and then making space for each of these communities of stakeholders to not only be reflected in your work, but to be valued and seen as critical to the vitality of your culture and your business is why bridges are so paramount. And then that third way that I want to think about bridging is through our products. And I know for some of us, it can be really frustrating to know that some folks have a harder time understanding why accessible products are important until it directly impacts them. And so, in thinking about creating policies and programs and products, we know because there's data to support it that when we create inclusive products and accessible products, it's better for all of us. Some folks just need that additional framing to see the value by seeing themselves represented or folks that they care about represented and reflected in those realities. Your products should be informed by the breadth of the communities that you aim to serve, and your people, so the folks who work within your companies and your organizations, should reflect those communities. Your products can actually act as bridges when they are informed by the diverse communities who built them. I want to drop one more prompt in the chat, and it's on the screen for you as well. Another point of
I got you.
reflection. Oh, thank you so much. An opportunity for you all to reflect. And in our next and final reflection question, I'll ask you all to share it in the chat as well. But this one you could just think about or write down. And that is to think of a time when you extended a bridge or someone extended a bridge to you. And I'll give you all a minute to think about that before I talk about what it looks like to put these practices into action. Okay. So, how do we bridge? As we've said in some of our industry webinars before, equity work has to first start with you. So, to be able to bridge with others, it requires patience, a lot of it, honesty, a willingness to stay curious, and to also know when to hit the eject button when you feel yourself getting activated. This work is challenging, especially right now. So, being emotional, feeling charged, getting challenged, being frustrated is to be expected. Finding ways to acknowledge what activates you and having tools to address it is critical to being able to engage in the difficult conversations that are absolutely required to build some of these bridges in order to get to a place where you create belonging without othering. So instead of saying, you're welcome here as long as you walk, talk, and ride like us, you say, we can't wait to learn how to support your needs so that you're welcome and valued here just as you are. In order to do that, you have to start with establishing your own supports before you extend yourself to others. So, identifying what activates you in these types of conversations is critical. It might be the third or fourth conversation that you recognize. Every time that that topic comes up, I notice that I really struggle to stay connected, to stay curious, right? So, being able to identify what activates you, letting the other person know that you're feeling activated and that you need time to continue the conversation, or if it's a planning meeting, you need to step away, or you're in the process of trying to design a more equitable and inclusive process or product. Being able to let the folks know that you're partnering with to do that, that you need a minute to step away and you'll be back is important. Give yourself that time to decompress and gather yourself. This is a really important step. Don't try to just bypass it because you know you're doing good work and you know it's really important to have these conversations. If you try to just keep moving through when you're feeling really activated and don't give yourself the time to step back and reflect and decompress, you won't be able to have an effective conversation, right? Your brain sort of gets hijacked and you're not able to really stay present and curious. And then most importantly, come back to the conversation. So you do steps one, two, three. Don't forget to come back to it. Whether that's immediate or next week, that's okay, right? Give yourself that time and space to decompress and address your needs as you need to, but come back to the conversation so that you can keep moving forward. The next piece that's critical when we're thinking about how this shows up in our companies and in our organizations is to think about our values. And when you're aiming to bridge with someone, whether that's a staff person or a community member, a client, or an investor, having strong organizational values to lean on is crucial. So, your values are the foundation that you build your company culture, external programs, and products on. And I know that it can be difficult for folks to understand how they can have some of these difficult conversations with folks that have seemingly completely different values. You don't have to abandon your own company values or your individual personal values in order to bridge with folks who prioritize different ones. That's an opportunity for you to challenge yourself to be curious about perceived differences and then listen for that connection. Using your values as a jumping off point to bridge with others can also help to reground you if you start to lose the plot a bit, or if you get to a point where you recognize that bridging is not going to be an option in this moment in time. So, in order for bridging to work, it is important that at some point that person or that other company is able to be open and receptive to bridging as well. I do want to talk about a case study to sort of exemplify what it looks like to maybe hold values that don't hold a ton of water. And Volkswagen, some of you might be familiar with this example, but in 2014, they had a whole host of values, including customer focus, top performance, creating value, renewability, respect, responsibility, and sustainability. And in 2015, it was reported that Volkswagen modified their software to enable them to falsify their data around diesel fuel emissions to falsely meet environmental standards. So, not only did this demonstrate a complete misalignment with their company values, but that misalignment severely damaged staff, consumer, and investor trust, which, hint, hint, impacts their ability to build or rebuild strong relationships that are crucial to bridging. Company values are not just these fluffy, feel good words that your HR team or your people teams create policies and procedures around, or just to stick up on the wall around the office. They should ground every aspect of your company's projects, your programs, and your products. And then the last piece I want to talk about is going back to listening for that point of connection and creating bridges to then connect those dots. Bridging requires strong relationships. Callum has called back to this throughout her examples. I've continued to talk about the importance of being able to stay calm and stay grounded and really sort of lean into these relationships as you're trying to build bridges. Oftentimes when we enter into difficult conversations, even when we have the goal to find some common ground, like Kellum said, we bring our irrefutable evidence, we've done our research, we have data, and then we're off to the races to try to win a debate or to prove a point or to be right. Human connection is really the best jumping off point for building your bridge, not data. So, whether it's working with your internal teams or building new relationships in the community or working with a new investor, really try to focus on building that relationship first. Bridging is really challenging work. It is slow work, and it's also critical to supporting your teams, communities, and ultimately to the viability of your business. We live in an ever changing and diversifying global community. You all are well familiar that even our local communities are shifting rapidly, and they look different than they did 10 or 15 years ago, which is a beautiful thing. We're building products and programs for communities that are increasingly diverse, and this creates lots of opportunity for increased divisiveness. But if we're intentional, if we're thoughtful, and we're strategic, we can build bridges that create belonging instead of othering. So, to close us out a bit, I would love to provide an opportunity for you all to not only reflect on this question, but to really create some space for you to share some of your ideas with each other. I know this is a webinar, so you can't see each other, but to drop in the chat some of your responses to this question so that you all can take those resources with you back to your own companies, back to your organizations, and to start to put some of these into practice. So I will stop talking for a minute so that you can reflect. And then again, please share your ideas in the chat, and Callum and I will talk a bit about them, reflect on them. Thank you for sharing your reflection around getting really activated and frustrated when you're trying to build a bridge, right? So maybe you go in with the intention to build, and then someone says something. And I think this is especially challenging when someone has said something that is hurtful or harmful about an identity that you hold or a community that you're close to. It's really difficult to try to continue that conversation. Recognizing that and being able to name it and asking for an opportunity to walk away and revisit the conversation is so important. The curiosity piece has helped me a lot as well. So I appreciate folks lifting this one up as well. I think digging and not making assumptions about what folks are trying to communicate or where they might be coming from or making assumptions about their background, but really leading with curiosity to give folks that opportunity to share more about where they're coming from and where their ideas stem from. And then you being able to find those opportunities to build some connection there is really important. Callum, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm reflecting on what a lot of people are saying about, staying curious, asking questions, remaining reflective in communication rather than reflexive. I like that reflective piece of, one of the techniques that I use as a facilitator is when people respond to me, I will reflect back what they say, what they've said to me in slightly different language to ensure that I understand. And that gives them an opportunity to notice where I either have understood them correctly or where I've misunderstood them. And again, that's about like really grounding into the desire to understand rather than to argue. And I notice people saying, assuming positive intent. And I think there's sort of two sides to assuming positive intent that when if you can build the internal framework for yourself that when someone hurts your feelings to assume that they didn't mean to hurt your feelings, assume that positive intent. And similar, kind of the flip side of that is if someone comes to you and says, this thing you did hurt me, then understanding that regardless of what you intended, because we rarely intend to hurt each other, but to understand the impact and to listen to the impact and be willing to say, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I hurt you. And recognizing that's not I didn't hurt if I say something that hurts Sienna's feelings, that didn't happen because I'm a bad person. That happened because I was speaking out of bias or speaking out of thoughtlessness, but not and realizing we can change our behavior, and that doesn't mean that we're a bad person. It just means we have space to grow.
Thank you, Callum. I was looking at that one as well and thinking about that, how important the accountability piece is for that, for folks to be able to assume positive intent is also for the other party to be able, for us to be able to honor the impact. And we can appreciate the intent, right? Knowing that we hopefully don't intend to harm each other and hurt each other.
I also
Lizzie, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I noticed Christine said when riding with others, ask more questions about pace, distance, and goals for the ride. As someone who is never fast, whether I'm hiking or biking or anything, that is so important. I've been on hikes with people where they have just sped on ahead of me, and it really hurts my feelings. I'm like, I thought we were here to spend time together. And that I come from a place of a lot of privilege, and so and having spent a lot of time outside. So especially when working with people or interacting with people who don't have the same level of experience in a space, like not assuming that we're all on the same page. That's something that's a sort of cognitive bias that we all have, that we assume that everyone around us is on the same page. Instead, asking questions. And even if you're like, oh yeah, like that person's got their like fancy bike jersey on, they probably like know what they're doing. Just, being willing to ask questions about those things can be, it feels small. Like, how fast are you comfortable riding? Like, have you been okay with the pace over the last 2 miles? Doesn't necessarily feel huge, but can make a really big impact.
Thanks, Callum. Yep, that's a big one for sure, and calls back to high school for me. We had backpacking trips as a part of our education, and I was always the smallest person, and was always at the back. And so it's really difficult when you feel like you're sort of holding up the rest of the group and you don't want to say anything and you really want to do your best to stay, a part of the community. And sort of asking those questions and being able to pace in a way that really supports everyone is important. And it makes me think of the fact that I think for a lot of us, asking the question if folks have any allergies or dietary restrictions now is kind of common practice, whereas even 5 or 10 years ago, right, was not as common. Some of those questions, I think, just being able to create the space for folks to say, actually, I prefer to go a bit slower, or my preference would be to keep it under 10 miles. Um, is something that really is supportive for all of us. I was going to just acknowledge Lizzie's comment around incorporating company values into monthly, yearly goals, which made me really excited because thinking about, again, utilizing your values as something that is foundational to how you build your teams, how you build your product, right? They, again, shouldn't be the sort of these words that are just nice, but they don't really have anything tangible to ground your work in. I think, they should live in your strategic planning processes. They should live in your performance reviews, right? So thinking about how you're using them in one-on-ones with your teams are all great ways to make sure that, again, they have these tangible, practical uses.
I see Ben saying like meeting people where they are, like where they already are, especially when meeting with people that you either know or suspect you may not fully align with. And I've found, again, I keep using my parents as an example, but we again do not see eye to eye on a lot of issues, but I've found building, and someone said in the chat too about like creating space to be like, this might be an uncomfortable conversation and that's okay. Just to recognize that and to acknowledge it has been useful in my conversations with them. And then also like meeting them where they are. Like in conversations with my mom, one time she was like, I've realized that I tend to like be biased against people who are older, which is interesting even as I'm getting older. And I found that people keep surprising me. I keep thinking like, wow, I bet I'm not on the same page with this person, and then finding points of connection because we've all had moments where we have felt othered, where we have felt like we don't belong in a space, and whether regardless of our identities. And so finding ways to connect experiences across identities, because even if we have very different experiences as a result of our backgrounds and our identities, we all share emotional experiences. We're all of us are human. We all have the same feelings, and so finding ways to build bridges between those emotional experiences can be a really powerful way to create understanding across differences.
Thank you, Callum. You also acknowledged an aspect of this is having your biases sort of on Front Street a bit when you're going through this process. So, a lot of us go into some of these conversations again making assumptions, whether that's based on how someone looks or their accent or where they're from. And so when you're going into these conversations and looking for those opportunities to bridge, it might become apparent to you that you held some assumptions about folks that aren't necessarily true, right? And highlight some biases that you had. And I know that happens for me a lot more than I like to admit now that I live in the South. And being someone who's born and raised Californian, I am often confronted with the reality that have been making assumptions, or come to conclusions about where I think people lean politically or what their social perspectives are. And then I have conversations with folks and they say things, and I'm frustrated that I'm surprised by some of the things that they're saying. And for me, it's highlighting some biases that, I thought I was going to have to go into a process of building these really long bridges. And I really just had to sit and do some reflection and work on my own bias. There was another one in here from Rachel that I wanted to comment on around shared goals and interests, right? Really trying to focus there. And it made me think about whether you're in the office or on a group ride. Something that we do in a lot of our workshop is we create community agreements, right? So we go into this process of building what we want this space to look like for each other, what we need in the space for us to have the shared goal and outcome that we're looking for. And so that could be a really incredible way for folks to start meetings or to start a group ride, is to have a conversation about what our shared goals and interests are, right? So we all, and I talked about this earlier, we're all coming together on one shared interest, but we're coming from different paths. So what you're looking for out of a ride might be different from what your neighbor is looking for. And so creating that space to have that conversation is really a great idea. Callum, any others that you want to lift up before we've sort of used this as an opportunity to share resources and ideas with each other, and we want to create space for folks to use the Q&A function and ask any questions if you have any. But if there's any that you want to lift up before we move there, Callum. Okay, great. Any questions that folks have? Okay, no questions, which is okay. Hopefully, folks are leaving with some morsels that they can continue to chew on and little tidbits to think about. I know I'm gonna be thinking about that comet metaphor for a while, and I know someone else lifted that up in the chat, Kellen. That was a really great metaphor to think about people as comets, and think about these really long tails that we have that, as you zoom in on that tail, you see that there are so many different particles and pieces of matter that make up that tail. And I think that's a great way to think about all of the humans that we're coming into connection with. And that these bridges, again, are slow to build, but if you take that time, they're strong, and they can help us to continue to find our shared goals and connections together. So thank you all so much for being here.
There's
Kellen,
a
did you want to close out with anything?
Yeah, there's a question from Mimi in the Q&A. I think about how this type of conflict behavior is the most relevant when we are in times of stress, and how do we combat that as an organization. Um, I'll throw in my 2 cents. I think if in an organization in times of stress, having regular check-ins with as a team and as individuals and starting meetings on a human front. So instead of just like, all right, let's get down to business. We've got this thing we've got to address. Asking people, let's start with checking in. Like, what's a one of the ones I like to use is rose and thorn. Like, what's something that's going well for you right now? What's something that you are struggling with? What's something that's hard? And I think that can be kind of help people level and sort of it allows you by acknowledging the stress and also acknowledging the good, just acknowledging that we are people outside of this room, outside of this meeting, outside of this particular conflict. By acknowledging it, we're not pretending it's not there. And so that allows us to sort of deactivate, put it aside, and then address the issue at hand. Sienna, I'd love any ideas you have too.
Yeah, on that note, I think for leadership, so oftentimes leadership can feel like they have to have the answer to the issue. And so that can sort of uh, stop the want or opportunity to create space to talk about the challenge, whether that's an internal challenge that's coming up, or folks have questions about how the company or organization is responding to a specific cultural or social or political issue. You don't have to have the answers all the time. It's okay to not have the answers. It would be good to go back and talk about how you're going to address the issue in the future, but you don't have to have the answers all the time. And staff really appreciate when you name, we don't actually know, or we haven't thought about that. Um, I think folks think about these issues around transparency as we need to be transparent and have the answer. You can also just say, we haven't thought about that, and we are going to now take that as an opportunity to go back to our leadership team and have a conversation about how we might address that. We want to partner with folks to think about how to address these issues in the future. But I do think it's incredibly important to create that space for the conversations to be had. Okay. Thank you all so much for your ideas and your engagement in the chat. It really creates this wonderful opportunity for us to have an authentic dialogue, and have a bit of a back and forth in a webinar format, and we really appreciate it. It's been an incredible experience and opportunity for us as the Avarna Group to partner with you all over the last year, and provide these webinars. So thank you for showing up. We hope you all have a great end of the year and happy soon to be 2026.
Thank you all.